Make us live.
Maybe remind everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll call this meeting the Standing Committee on Government Operations for today, January 12, 2023 to order. My name is Rylund Johnson. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife North and chair of this committee. Today, committee is holding a public hearing on Bill 67, an act to amend the Fire Prevention Act. This bill amends the Fire Prevention Act to add a liability exclusion provision for fire officials, authorize the fire marshal to delegate their duties and powers, make any requirements made in a plan review report by the fire marshal to be binding as orders, establish a plan review appeal board and mechanism for appeal of plan reviews made by the fire marshal instead of an immediate recourse to the Supreme Court, authorize codes of rules and standards adopted under the Act of legal force of effect, and modernize the language, including the use of gender-neutral language. As a standing committee, it is our role to review any legislation in this House. The committee review stage provides stakeholders and the public with an opportunity to provide their opinions on whether or not they support the bill. It also allows the public to suggest changes for a committee to consider bringing forward any amendments that they think may help improve the bill. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. I would like to remind all members and witnesses to direct all comments and questions through myself as chair to help keep the meeting organized and running smoothly. Please wait to be recognized by myself, the chair, before speaking. I will now ask members of this committee to introduce themselves, beginning with our deputy chair, MLA Martzellos.
MLA Martzellos, MLA for Tavacha.
Caitlin Cleveland Cam Lake.
Thank you, and any members joining us virtually.
Lisa Semler, MLA for Nuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you, and with that, Minister, I will turn it over to you to provide any opening remarks you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee, for inviting me here to speak to a committee about the Bill 67, the Act to amend the Fire Prevention Act. I'd like to introduce the officials with me today. They are Ms. Jennifer Young, Director of Corporate Affairs, Municipal and Community Affairs, Mr. Justin Hazenberg, Director of Public Safety, Municipal and Community Affairs, Jeff Ray, Minister of Special Advisor, and Ian Rennie, Legislative Council, Department of Justice. The purpose of Bill 67 is to improve regulatory functions by, and among others, creating a more authoritative plan review process that includes a formal avenue of appeal for plan review decisions. The bill also includes an exclusion of liability clause, protections that statutory actors for actions or omissions done in good faith in the course of their duties. Mr. Chair, the Department is aware that these amendments to the Fire Prevention Act are long awaited. The Department's work on reviewing the Fire Prevention Act began in the 18th Legislative Assembly. Most recently, the Department conducted engagement with resident stakeholders to understand the areas of the Act that needed review and to ensure that there was a sound basis for amendments. The majority of stakeholders supported changes made to the plan review function and inclusion of the appeals board because, in the absence of a building standards legislation, plan review is the only legislative review for compliance with the adopted code and standards for fire prevention purposes in the NWT. Or Northwest Territory, sorry. In addition to substantive amendments, this bill makes several housekeeping amendments that were suggested by the Legislation Division of the Department of Justice to gender neutralize language and fix non-substantive grammatical errors in the Act. Mr. Chair, the Department recognizes that Bill 67 does not fully address the need for a building standards framework in the Northwest Territories. The Department's most recent engagement identified strong support for consideration of building standards legislation as a future legislative priority. While the Department anticipates proceeding with the building standard legislation in the 20th Legislative Assembly, further research and engagement with industry stakeholders and community governments will be needed before advancing this work. Mr. Chair, I look forward to hearing comments from committee and answering any questions that members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Are there any questions or comments from committee for the Minister? MLA Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I've got one question in particular, and it's in regards to any intention to regulate the certification of service providers under the Fire Prevention Act. And I'm wondering if there is an intention to include any kind of licensing qualification requirements or insurance compliance requirements in any future regulations under the Fire Prevention Act. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Short answer, no.
MLA Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I know that this is something that was provided in feedback by some industry leaders, and I'm wondering why it is not intended to go forward with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you. Could the member be more specific in what she's asking, so we hopefully can get the answer? Thank you.
Clarification, MLA Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm looking for information or, I guess, reasoning why it is not intended to include the requirement of a service provider who provides services like servicing to sprinkler systems are a great example, actually, under the Fire Prevention Act, and why somebody providing that type of certification would not be required to have any kind of licensing specific qualifications or insurance compliance under the Fire Prevention Act. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you. With your permission, I'd like Mr. Hazenberg to answer that question. Thank you.
Heisenberg?
Thank you. The Act itself does not specifically address that, but some of the standards that the regulations adopt will have outlines on what the qualifications of the individuals to perform the services are in those standards, so they are then adopted through the regulation.
Any further clarification, MLA Cleveland?
So the intent is to have standards under regulations then that would address those issues. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister? Any further questions, comments from committee? Hearing none, I had some questions. Can you tell me who you anticipate the placing on the appeal board? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With your permission, Ms. Young, please.
Go ahead.
We plan to place professionals from related associations to be on the board. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That's really all I wanted to hear. Can you clarify whether the intention would be to have any public servants on it? I think probably MACA having an oversight role of the fire marshal, and then to place any GNWT employees on it would put them in a tough spot. So it would all be made up of professionals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do plan to engage with industry stakeholders as well as members that were part of our working group, which included representatives from other departments within the GNWT to identify what would be the best composition of the board. And pending that engagement, we'll be able to better answer that question, but I do believe that it would be multidisciplinary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any further questions, comments from committee? Hearing none, thank you, Minister, for your presentation today. We'll proceed to see if there are any public presentations. Maybe sign us off for 1 minute, Andrew? Take one. Good afternoon. I'll now call this public hearing on the Standing Committee on Government Operations back to order. We have one public presentation today by Sarah Brown from the NWTAC and Rebecca Alty. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So the NWT Association of Communities, I'm the president and joined by the CEO, Sarah Brown. We're here on behalf of the NWT Association of Communities, which represents all 33 communities in the Northwest Territories. So first off, we'd like to thank the Standing Committee on Government Operations for providing us with the opportunity to comment on Bill 67, an act to amend the Fire Prevention Act. It's definitely been on our radar for a number of years, and we appreciate that coming to the conclusion on this one so that we can move on to other important legislation, particularly the property taxes and assessments, as well as the senior citizens and disabled, as well as new legislation that we'd like GNWT to consider. So for today, we'd like to provide comments basically in two groups. First, as they relate to the actual proposed act and the changes, and the second as they relate to the discussion document and the what we heard document. First, as to the proposed amendments in the Fire Prevention Act, we were pleased to see the added liability exclusion for fire officials performing statutory functions under the Act. This is critical to protecting local assistance in particular. We also support the requirement that any plan reviews report from the fire marshal is binding. Under the current act, where the only binding orders are at occupancy, this approach, as proposed in the legislation, has proven numerous times, the current legislation has proven numerous times to be too late in the process. So this should not lead to an elimination of an inspection by either the fire marshal or designate or the designer. We're pleased to see the establishment of a plans review appeal board. This is a far more appropriate process than appeal to the Supreme Court. However, we would like to see performance standards in terms of plan reviews, and we would like to see the review appeal board actually have dates included. So if you take a look at another piece of legislation that MACA has, it's the Community Planning and Development Act. Section 64.3 outlines commencing a subdivision appeal, and it says an appeal must be commenced within 30 days after receiving the application. Section 66.1 of the Community Planning and Development Act says that hearing must occur within 30 days. And the other thing is that it has a section in the Community Planning and Development Act that talks about the decision of the appeal board. And it states there's time limits, so the appeal board shall, within 60 days after the day on which a hearing is concluded, issue a written decision. The current legislation talks about, apologies as I jump around, the board shall, without delay, hold a hearing. However, a recommendation is that, of course, we want to plan for have the best happen, but plan for the worst. And so actually having those timelines written into legislation, we feel has been helpful in other pieces of legislation. It's also an industry standard in terms of plan reviews in other jurisdictions. And in regards to making the legislation gender neutral, we welcome that, and would also recommend, if the committee might not be your committee, but the public pool regulations could use a gender review, since right now we have to provide change rooms and bathrooms for men and women. Definitely recommend folks taking a look at that legislation for the gender neutral aspect. Outside of what's being proposed, we'd like to highlight a number of themes that were discussed in the consultation, which we did appreciate with the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs. One is whether it was described directly as funding or indirectly as resources, training, or capacity. We recommend that adequate funding for fire prevention is absolutely critical. Like all municipal services, inadequate funding in the order of 40% deficits is going to impact the delivery of all services in communities. Number two, as the minister mentioned before, nothing has been done with the discussion yet on the building standards framework, and the Northwest Territories is the only jurisdiction in Canada without a building act, and so we do encourage, recognizing it won't be this assembly, but that it's in the transition document for the next assembly to look at. The This process cannot, without few exemptions, be handed over to community governments to manage. And the NWTAC believes that a model of legislation similar to the Yukon, where building standards are managed by a territorial authority, is one of the more appropriate approaches. And as discussed in consultations, we'd also like to see an extension of indemnification to include all fire departments and firefighters. This is in place already in Alberta in their Municipal Government Act, which is equivalent to our Cities, Towns and Villages Act or our Hamlets Act. We appreciate that many of the items in the last group of comments is perhaps outside the scope of this amendment. However, we feel it'd be negligent if we hadn't highlighted them for you at this time. In closing, we want to once again reiterate that we appreciate the opportunity to provide these comments to the Standing Committee on Government Operations, and we'd be open to any questions from the committee, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mayor Alty. Are there any questions, comments from committee? Emily O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and sorry I got here a little bit late, but it appeared that the speaking notes were a little more detailed than what we've got in this written presentation. Do we have the speaking notes from Mayor Alty? If not, could we get them? No. Oh, I just couldn't see the details on section 67 of some other legislation. It seemed like they were a little bit more detailed than what we've got in the written presentation. But, sorry, go ahead.
Mayor Alty, can you provide us that additional detail?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so it was actually just in a meeting right before lunch, and so that sparked this, but I will send it on to committee after this meeting.
Thank you. Emily O'Reilly?
Thanks. I don't know. I know you're here wearing at least one hat, but maybe with whatever hat you would like, if you might be able to describe just a few examples of maybe some of the cases or frustrations with the current legislation and what kind of impact it's had on maybe municipal operations. I think it would be just helpful for us to understand some of the context of why you're making some of these recommendations and why you support the changes in general. Thanks.
Thank you. Mayor Alty?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think in particular the comment that I hear from residents in particular is regarding the plan review, and right now the process is that you can appeal to the minister, and after that it's, the next big step is the Supreme Court. So actually having an appeals board, which is what happens in other jurisdictions, people feel is an important step that's not currently there. It's also to actually include those dates that it has to, you have to have a hearing. There's an appeal decision that will be made by this time is also an important one. I have a lot of experience with that with the Development Appeal Board. Sometimes it does mean you're setting an appeal hearing on December 23rd to make it, but it's ensuring that we're meeting the deadlines and that folks know what they can expect from us. And in regards to the orders being binding, I think that one's another one, just making more clarity, I would say, in the legislation and at earlier stages. But Sarah, did you want to add anything else? Okay.
Thank you. Any follow-up, Emily O'Reilly? Perhaps just along the same lines, can you help me understand how city building inspectors fit into this picture and kind of their relationship with the fire marshal's approval process? And my kind of understanding is that they're operating in pretty strong silos right now. So any work we could do to make sure that they're informing each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that we have a resolution with the NWT Association of Communities to be able to have the fire plan reviews delegated to municipalities along with the resources required to complete that. We see it as an opportunity to have the one-stop shop, because right now people have to come in, put their building permits in. For the city, we review it from our aspect. They've got to go deal with the GNWT on a number of aspects. So being able to have our building inspectors review it all at once, we we see as an opportunity to again, be that one-stop shop. From the client perspective, it's also a comment that I hear is that the one person doing it at MACA is pretty overwhelmed, and so there's quite the delay. So again, being able to, whether the GNWT is putting in a second staff person to be able to stay up on top of these reviews, or basically contracting it out by delegating that authority down to the city so that we can handle the stuff in the city. MACA's review could do all the remaining communities. So we'd welcome the opportunity to begin those discussions again, but we do have a resolution through the NWTAC, and we'd be happy to share that one. Is there anything to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for the smaller communities, our mayoral team mentioned that most of the other communities have no capacity at all to be doing plans reviews or inspections. So we really like the Yukon model because they actually, half of their inspectors do Yellowknife and half of their inspectors do the rest of the territory, and I assume a similar split for plans review. So we think that would be a good way to handle it.
Thank you. Yeah, I believe it's a similar model in Nunavut too, and really anywhere who has done this. Thank you. Any further questions, comments from committee? With that, we would like to thank you very much for presenting today, and committee will have a discussion about your larger asks and the specific one to the bill. Thank you. And I think with that, are there any further presentations from the public? We will end this public hearing. Thank you everyone for tuning in today. Take a